16 years I hadn't seen Alex, but that feeling for him still lived in my heart. I was running down the street. I hate to walk slowly, and then suddenly rang, and like I was running into an invisible barrier. I could barely keep my balance. My heart was pounding like crazy, and it wasn't from running. Man walking toward me was surprisingly similar to Alex. My God, was it really him? It was him. Alright, should I run away before it's too late? Speak first or wait until he recognizes me? What if he doesn't? It's been, my God, 16 years, hasn't it? A lifetime. Of course he won't. I've become an old woman in that time. She pressed her palms against her flaming cheeks. 16 years later, Alex evoked the same emotions in me as an hour student passed. I took a deep breath, blew out my pains from my forehead, and shouted as if I was rushing from a bridge into a whirlpool. Alex! Marina? God, what a meeting! He accurately grabbed me and kissed me on my cheeks. At that point I understood. I'm not that old. Do you have half an hour? We can get some coffee and chat a little bit? Without waiting for my response, Alex grabbed my arm and almost dragged me in the direction of the door with a sign cafe. I laughed as you have remained, stab eagle, dashing cross-neck, except for a slightly flattened figure and slight grain on his temples. Alex hadn't changed a bit. It felt like we were a 20-something who had just come out of the uni building. I always have free time to drink coffee with you. Later, I responded and took a seat. Alex sat across from me and put his fist under his chin. Well, tell me. Tell me what? How much I love you? How then, when you suddenly disappeared, soaked at night for 6 months, how in the hope of outsourcing the first love from my heart, I married practically the first man I met. How did I almost faint when I saw you? I thought, and with an effort of will, I pulled the mask of equanimity over myself. Ask, do you still live here, or are you here on business? Where do you work? What do you do? Are you married? Children? Do you see any of our people? He was literally flooding me with questions. Yeah, I live here. I'm business. I have to work hard, but there are no money problems. I don't see anybody from here. You know how it is. Everyone lives his own life. Everybody's hustling, trying to get to the top. I always have a lot of hustle and bustle and work. It's good that there are vacations and you can go somewhere for a while. Do you still go to the mountains? Alex looked at me in the way that made my cheeks flush. Sometimes. Oh, those were the days. Alex sighed. And remember our trip? Does he think I'll ever be able to forget it? We had just finished our sophomore year and decided as a group to go to the mountains. That's where I fell madly in love with him. There was a reason for that. Alex has always been the soul of our company, and on the trip just found him with fantastic idea. And now he played the guitar, how he parroted the lectures, would just roll on the ground with laughter. He was always near me, but not so close that we became a couple. We went the same roads, but not together. I know he was very nice to me, as if I were his girlfriend. I was hoping that sometimes more was about to happen between us, that mutual understanding would sparkle. I kept waiting for him to make some decisive steps, to do something, to say something, to make a gesture. After returning from our trip, Alex and I continued to see each other almost every day. Sometimes we met in the city and went for a walk. And when the weather was bad, he came to me. I sensed that Alex enjoyed these meetings, but he made not the slightest attempt to reduce the distance between us that he himself had established. We went to cafes, to the movies, and to the theaters. We climbed up on a narrow couch, chatting about everything. Sometimes he looked so that my heart sank. Here, now he's gonna kiss. But no, he did not. Not once. Me, as best as I could, convinced myself that love for Alex, not just physical attraction, but also the complete kinship of souls, and his demeanor, restrained by the fact that he thinks our relationship is too serious to force them. I've been convincing him for 4 whole years, right up until my graduation. And then Alex suddenly disappeared. Yeah, that's right, he disappeared. Yesterday we went to a photo exhibition together, and today he disappeared without a trace. He didn't call, he stopped calling, and he didn't answer the phone. My pride was enough only for a week, and then I went to Alex's house. The door was open by his mother. Are you here to see Alex? He's not here. No, not today. Not tomorrow. Well, I can tell him, but don't tell the others about it, okay? Alex went to his father in Canada. Why so suddenly? I got a summons from the Army Registry Office, so I decided to send him. Don't look at me like that. When you have a grown-up son, then you'll understand what I mean. To let your little one go to the army? On the way home, I almost got hit by a car because I couldn't see anything around me because of the tears that were covering my eyes. Why didn't you tell me? The summons didn't come yesterday. It must have taken a few days to process the visa and other formalities. How could he? Packs bounded in my head, and then began to think of excuses. Probably up to the last minute I hoped that with the enlistment office somehow it would be the other way sorted out. Or maybe he didn't want to upset him before the time. Or maybe he was afraid of my tears and decided that he would explain everything in the first letter. I looked in the mailbox twice a day, morning and evening. On weekends, even 3. But there were no letters. I was very ill with this love. I could not come to my senses for then half a year. Marina, what are you thinking about? Oh, various things. You still haven't told me about your family. Or is that a taboo subject? I've been married for 11 years. And you? Married? I prayed to God that the phrase sounded straight. Yes, I've been married 3 years longer than you. I have a son. Happy? My voice still treacherously trembled. And I don't have kids. At first, I didn't want to, but I kept putting it off. And now, I waved my hand in a doleful expression. You see, for many years, my first priority was work and money. I did not want to live as my parents, to count every penny, to deny themselves everything to reach the paycheck. This fear is still in me. I do not have time for anything. I work like a herd of oxen. It's a family picture. I was always rushing around. But one day I thought about it, and damn it, I'm almost 40. A critical age for a man who knows how much more is measured. I suddenly realized that I need to do something good for myself. Just for myself. So I realized my lifelong dream. I joined a parachuting club. Now, that's great. I listened to Alex with admiration. What a good boy he is. He knows how not only to dream, but also make them true. And how many times I promised myself to dive, and still I am. My nose tingled with tears. Why wasn't I with him? Why couldn't I win his love? It was a question I asked myself hundreds of times, and I'll probably never know. What happened? Alex asked anxiously and put his arm around my shoulders. I heard pull it away. I'm sorry. It's okay. I was just making a little excursion into the past. Now that everything is working out the way we wanted to, he said after a long pause. Not everything. I agreed. Maybe we should take a risk and try to change this. He looked at me with such a talking look that I'm like a gymnasium girl, almost fainted. At that moment, my cell phone rang. Husband. Marina, well, where do you go? Customers have already arrived and you're still not. What should I tell them? How inopportune this call. Or, on the contrary, convenient? We could run away on a plausible pretext. Alyosha, I'm sorry, but I have to go back to work urgently. I hope we'll meet again in 20 years. It wasn't a very good joke, but I had to say something. I was glad to see you. Alex got up from the table and hugged me. He touched my temple with his lips and held me in his arms for a few moments. Goodbye, Marina. Bye. I waved my hand and without turning around, hurriedly walked to the exit. I wanted to howl with longing. Why now? Why did I meet him now when I almost forgotten him, almost erased him from my heart? I was so good, so calm, and now a chance encounter, and all the memories, all the pain settled on the very bottom of the soul, suddenly rose to the top. As disturbed self from the bottom of the river. Well, why did he come back into my life again? Are you not feeling well? My husband asked worriedly. I have a headache. I have since morning. My hand split. Oleg took out 2 pills from the package, one thrust in his mouth, the second handed me. Here we go. In 15 minutes, everything gonna be alright. The customers will be back from lunch soon. We'll discuss in terms of the new contract. They don't give us much time, but we'll get through it. I already knew what was behind this can-do. Work for 12 hours a day, perhaps even without a weekend. Work, work, work. I joined the parachute club. X word suddenly came to my mind. She thought of him, and her cheeks flushed with the fire again. God, what kind of obsession. How he stick to my hat, to my heart, to my soul. How does it go? Why did you meet? Why did you disturb my peace? What film is this song from? Oh yes, the Kuban Cossacks. Only the heroes end up staying together. But me and Alex are not destined to. Or? My hesitation lasted for 2 weeks. And then my mother called. Marina, you have a letter. Strangely enough, it was sent to the old address. Maybe from one of your former classmates? No, there's a return address. Postmark? Let me see, Smolensk. Same day I went to my parents and picked up the letter. Marina, I'm convinced that our meeting was not an accident. I dreamed about you all night. Will you give me a chance to correct my mistakes? If not, I'll understand. We'll be waiting for your response. Your Alex. He loves me! Marina, are you coming to dinner? Shouted the husband from the kitchen. There were 2 cups of tea and plate of sandwiches on the table. We have a lot of work to do on weekdays. We eat nothing but dry food. Oleg does not grumble, he understands. Will Alex understand? And whether he wants to put up with my working marathons. And I'm already so involved that I do not imagine a different life. As a student, I was madly in love with Alex. But even then, I did not know much about him. I don't know anything about Alex now. I remembered a phrase I once read. Unrequited love can burn for years. Mutual love either grows into love or goes out. Who knows if my long-standing crush, this essentially stranger, could grow into love? And Oleg, so familiar. Oleg, do you want baked hash browns? My husband was surprised. He said there are a lot of problems with them. I know perfectly well that hash browns with sour cream, his favorite dish. I wonder, what's Alex's favorite dish? The thought flashed, and as if a wave came over her with the next one. I don't know. And I don't want to know. Wait a minute. I rushed into the bathroom, pulled out of my pocket a letter from Alex, and it was the words, "You're 16 years too late," ripped it into pieces. And at once it became so calm and so understandable. Back in the kitchen said, "A lot of fuss. So what? 4 hands? You peel the potatoes, and I'll grate. Together, we can do anything."